If on a winter morning in the howling winds and blinding snow of Dakota, you saw a woman splitting firewood alone, her hands cracked and bleeding, would you walk past? Or stop? The story you're about to hear isn't just about love, it's about survival, about a promise that sounded almost insane, yet ended up changing the fate of two strangers forever. And if you've ever thought your life had run out of new chances, stay with me until the end, because you just might start believing in something called unexpected happiness again. That winter, Dakota felt like a sheet of white paper torn apart by the razor-sharp bite of the north wind. Snow piled thick on rooftops pushed through the cracks in window frames, and the cold seeped deep into the bone. Delilah Marsh, 30 years old, had lived through 2 years since her husband Thomas was lost forever in a blizzard on Eagles Pass. Since that day, she had lived quietly, keeping his wedding ring on a chain against her heart, part keepsake, part shield, to keep others from stepping into her life. Her small log cabin was falling apart, piece by piece. The roof leaked, the windows were cracked, the chicken coop had lost half its flock to foxes, and the vegetable garden had been swallowed by weeds. Still, she hung on splitting firewood every morning before the light fully broke, partly to keep the stove burning, partly to prove she hadn't yet bowed to winter. That morning, as Delilah wrestled a stubborn log, the sound of hoofbeats carried through the frozen air. Out of the white haze emerged a rider, so tall that even on the back of a powerful horse he seemed to brush the clouds. Ephraim Cutter, a name known across the region not because he spent much time in town, but because of the near-legendary stories a man over 7 feet tall, who could lift a calf in his bare arms, who had once walked dozens of miles through a snowstorm to save a dying child. Some said he carried the blood of northern giants, others claimed he was kin to native warriors. But everyone agreed on one thing: Ephraim Cutter was not like other men, and not someone you approached lightly. Delilah never imagined that man would stop at her gate. He dismounted with slow, deliberate movements, removed his hat, and revealed hair the color of ripe wheat and eyes as blue as the winter sky. "Mrs. Marsh," he said, his deep, steady voice carrying a weight that made one listen. She answered with the bare minimum of courtesy, unable to hide a flicker of self-consciousness about her patched dress and the loose strands of hair escaping her bun. Ephraim didn't waste words. After a few comments about the winter and the hard life here, he stepped closer, looked her straight in the eye, and said something most men wouldn't dare say, even after years of knowing a woman. "I've come here with a proposal. Not the kind of proposal a woman usually hears from a stranger. But these aren't usual times. I have land, a house, money, and the means to provide for a family. I don't have a wife. You don't have safety. I want to marry you, and before winter comes, I want you carrying my son." Delilah went still. She had heard strange tales on the frontier, but never imagined she'd be the center of one, a proposal as practical as it was bold. Her heart, frozen by years of loss, instantly put up a wall of caution. What did he want? Why her when there were plenty of younger, prettier women with dowries? Ephraim seemed to read the doubt in her eyes. He continued, slow and deliberate. "I'm not choosing you because it's convenient. I'm choosing you because I've seen you split wood, seen you hold on to this land for 2 years on your own. You don't give up. And that's the quality a man wants in the mother of his child." Those words reached the deepest part of Delilah, the place where pride and self-respect still smoldered beneath the ash of grief. She knew she needed help, but the thought of marrying a man she had met only that morning felt like a gamble she wasn't ready to take. Not yet. He didn't press her. He simply said he'd be staying in town for a week. "When you decide you know where to find me," he finished, then mounted his horse again, leaving behind a yard so silent she could hear the pounding of her own heart. And if you think this was a rash, unromantic proposal, wait. Because from that moment on, their story would carry you through winters of white snow trials that would test them to the bone, and moments warm enough to melt the ice around a heart that had been locked away for 2 years. So here's the question for you. Could one bold, almost reckless promise truly save two people from the harshest winter, and from loneliness itself, if that first meeting had been like tossing a stone onto the frozen surface of a still lake? Then the days that followed were the ripples spreading outward, disturbing every quiet corner of Delilah's mind. Ever since the morning Ephraim Cutter rode away from her yard, his proposal had echoed in her thoughts, clear, plain, and without any adornment. "Before winter comes, you'll be carrying my son." Those words weren't just a promise. They were like a key brushing against a door that had been locked in her heart for 2 years. At first, Delilah tried to push the thought aside, with work. She cleaned out the chicken coop, split more wood, and mended the frayed strap of her apron. But the more she kept herself busy, the more the quiet moments between chores left her mind, drifting back to the image of the giant man, with eyes as cold and as warm as a winter sky, with a voice deep as a winter drumbeat. Part of her wanted to laugh at the absurdity, marrying a man she'd just met, and with the condition of bearing his child right away. Utter madness. But another part, the part that had endured a long winter so cold she'd slept every night in her thick coat because there wasn't enough wood, that part whispered, "What other way is there to survive?" on the second night. After their meeting, the wind whistled through the cracks in the door, making the flame of her oil lamp shiver. She pulled the blanket around herself, curled up in the cold, narrow bed, and thought about the heavy quilts a man like Ephraim surely owned. Thought about a roof that didn't leak a storeroom full of food for the whole winter, and hands big enough to shield her from any storm. But then the image of Thomas came back, his gentle smile, the warm timbre of his voice when he'd promised to protect her forever. Forever. But forever had ended in the blizzard that took him. On the third day, her closest friend Martha Henley came to visit. When Delilah told her about the proposal, Martha's eyes went wide. "You'd marry a man you met 3 days ago. Have you lost your mind?" "Maybe," Delilah sighed. "But I'd be losing my mind thinking I can survive another winter alone." Martha went quiet. No one knew better than she that Dakota winters showed no mercy, and no one knew better than Delilah that pride wouldn't keep you alive. On the morning of the 4th day, with the first light barely touching the snowy ridges, Delilah stepped outside. The wind cut at her cheeks like knives. She looked down the road that led to town, the road Ephraim had ridden away on, and in that moment she knew if she let him go without giving her answer, this winter would kill her, if not from the cold, then from the emptiness slowly eating away at her will. That afternoon she put on the only decent blue dress she owned, pinned her hair neatly, and saddled her horse for the ride into town. Mrs. Patterson, the innkeeper famous for her curiosity, raised her brows the instant Delilah stepped through the door. "Who are you looking for, Ephraim Cutter?" Delilah said, her voice steadier than she expected. He was at a table by the window, as if he'd known she would come. When their eyes met, Delilah saw something strange in his not surprise, but the readiness of a man who had been waiting. "So you're here to say—" He left the question open. "I'm saying yes." Delilah took a deep breath. "But I have one condition. I keep my house at least in the beginning. I need to know that if it doesn't work, I still have somewhere to go back to." Ephraim nodded without hesitation. "Agreed. But I don't think you'll want to go back." In that moment, an invisible weight lifted from Delilah's shoulders. Not because she had found an escape, but because she had chosen a new path, risky, yes, but one that at least led her out of the darkness she'd been walking through for 2 long years. When she left the inn, the wind was still sharp against her face, but it no longer cut through to her heart the way it had before. In 1 week, she would be Mrs. Ephraim Cutter, the towering man with the bold promise and her one chance to reach for hope before winter slammed every door shut. And if you're wondering what happens when 2 near strangers step into marriage together, stay with me. Because this decision will set off a chain of trials that will demand not just strength, but trust, the very thing that might save them, or destroy them both. Have you ever witnessed a wedding that didn't happen because of love at first sight? or because of a long-fated courtship, but because two people chose to stand side by side in order to survive. If you think weddings like that must be cold and distant, stay with me. This story will show you that sometimes the most practical beginnings plant the seeds for a kind of love more enduring than any flowery vow. Just 1 week after that meeting at the inn, the small Dakota town woke to the news the widowed Delilah Marsh was to marry the giant cowboy Ephraim Cutter. More curious onlookers crowded into the church than worshippers on a regular Sunday. Everyone wanted to see the man who had appeared out of nowhere and was now taking as his wife a woman known for her quiet independence. That morning the sky was a clear, cold blue, the kind of cold that found its way into every corner. Delilah stood in Martha Henley's bedroom, where she'd stayed the night before, to keep the tradition of not seeing the groom before the ceremony, and looked at herself in the mirror. Her blue wool dress was freshly pressed, its white lace collar belonging to her late mother, like a silent blessing. She wore pearl earrings borrowed from Martha, and in her hand she carried a small pouch with Thomas's wedding ring, not around her neck anymore, but still close to her. When she stepped into the church, she saw Ephraim at the altar. He wore a plain black suit that fit him well, his broad shoulders looking as though they could shield a whole house from the wind. His gaze locked on her unblinking, as if he wanted to etch this moment into his memory. When she reached his side, he leaned down and murmured, "You look beautiful, Delilah. You're not so bad yourself," she replied, the corner of her mouth curving. The vows were read. Ephraim's I-do rang out steady, like a hammer driving a stake into the ground. When it was her turn, Delilah looked up at him and saw not just resolve, but something that looked very much like faith. She said "I do not," because she was sure she loved him, but because she believed this was the one step that could open a different kind of life. When the minister said, "You may kiss the bride," Ephraim cupped her cheek, his massive hand astonishingly gentle, and kissed her as if making a promise with his whole heart never to leave her alone again. It wasn't a burning kiss, but a silent vow. After a small reception in the church hall, they set out for Ephraim's cabin on the mountainside more than 20 miles from town. The road was rough, but the view opening before her made Delilah catch her breath. Towering pines, glacial streams running clear, and in the distance, a honey-colored log house with a curl of smoke from its chimney, as though it had been waiting to welcome them home. Inside the cabin was warm and orderly. Every table, chair, and bed frame had been built by Ephraim's own hands. A large fireplace spread heat through the room. Every corner spoke of a man who had prepared not for a temporary guest, but for a lasting family. "This is our home," he said, "and I want you to feel safe here." In those first days, as husband and wife, Delilah found life with Ephraim to be a series of small but important gestures. He rose before dawn to light the fire and heat water, so she could wash in warmth. He fixed the roof-split wood and cared for the horses. She cooked meals, swept the floors, and began planting rows of vegetables near the kitchen. Neither of them spoke of love, but every act felt like laying another stone in the foundation of it. Evenings were spent by the fireplace drinking coffee or herbal tea from the supply Ephraim had stocked for her. He told her stories of his parents of winters high in the mountains, and sometimes they just sat in companionable silence, listening to the wind outside. Delilah realized that with him, silence wasn't awkward, it was peaceful, as if neither needed to rush to fill it with words. He never pressured her to forget the past. If he saw her sitting quietly with her old wedding ring in hand, he would simply set a cup of tea beside her and step outside, giving her space. That respect began to chip away at the ice in her heart. Once while repairing the fence, Ephraim slipped and slammed his hand hard against a post. Delilah rushed over, worried as if she'd been hurt herself. He smiled, took her hand and said, "I know I married the right woman because you care, even when you think you shouldn't." Mornings on the mountain began with the sound of roosters and the smell of fresh bread. Winter hadn't yet come, but inside the cabin it already felt like winter had lost its sting. Delilah began to see herself in this picture, not as a visitor, but as someone who belonged here. If someone looked at them and said their marriage was too practical, too lacking in romance, they didn't see the way their eyes met when one poured coffee for the other, or the quiet teamwork of gathering firewood before dark. Because sometimes love doesn't start with a racing heartbeat. It starts with a house warm enough to shelter you a meal split between two plates and someone patient enough to stay until you're ready to open your heart. And this story is only just beginning. The trials ahead will prove whether this blend of practicality and care can take root and grow into a love as deep as any that began with a spark. Have you ever thought that just when you've finally built yourself a safe, solid home life will test you almost as if to see whether the foundation can withstand a real storm? Delilah and Ephraim had enjoyed 3 months of peaceful life together on the mountainside. And then, one autumn afternoon, the storm came knocking. That day, the sky was layered with gray clouds, the faint scent of early snow drifting in the air. Delilah was hanging laundry on the porch when a glossy black carriage pulled up in the yard. From it stepped a tall, thin man in a long coat and black felt hat. His slicked hair and neatly trimmed mustache made him look like he'd just stepped out of the office of a wealthy Eastern banker. "Mrs. Delilah Marsh Cutter," he asked, his voice drawn out with an edge of unpleasant emphasis. "Yes, that's me," Delilah said, narrowing her eyes. The man gave a slight bow, then opened his leather case and produced a stack of papers. "I'm Silas Blackwood. I'm here to collect on an unpaid debt, a debt belonging to your late husband." The name Thomas flashed in Delilah's mind like the cold stab of a knife. Blackwood flipped to the first page and slid it toward her. $1,046.35 plus 2 years accrued interest. The bold print and bright red seal felt like nails driven straight into her vision. "There must be some mistake," Delilah stammered. "My husband never mentioned any debt like this." "Perhaps he didn't have the chance," Blackwood said with a shrug. "But the ink's on the page. If you don't pay within 2 weeks, I'll be forced to seize this property under the law." That whole afternoon, Delilah's mind spun. When Ephraim came back from the stables, he found his wife sitting at the kitchen table, the papers spread out before her. He read them, his eyes' narrowing jaw set like stone. "He said he'll take the house if we don't pay." Ephraim's voice was low and heavy. "Ephraim, this amount. We can't possibly," she began, but he cut her off. "We can. If I have to sell the herd, I'll do it. If the house stands and the land stays ours, we can start over." That single statement felt like a shield slammed down between her and the threat, but it also made Delilah's heart ache. She didn't want him to sacrifice everything for a debt she hadn't even known existed. "I can't let you do that. This is my problem. No, Delilah." Ephraim laid a steady hand on her shoulder, his gaze unshakable. "From the day you stepped into this house, your problems became our problems." They spent that night at the table making plans. Ephraim calculated how much they could get by selling the cattle and some of the tools, and talked about putting off his plans to expand the horse barn. Delilah listened in silence, grateful, but feeling the weight of a boulder pressing down on her chest. The next day, news of the debt spread quickly through town. Some whispered behind her back at the general store. Others looked at her with pity, or with the calculating eyes of men wondering how many of Ephraim's cattle might soon be up for sale. Martha came to the cabin, wrapped her arms around Delilah, and said softly, "If anyone can protect you from this, it's Ephraim. But I don't believe your first husband ever owed that kind of money." That thought stuck with Delilah all day. She began digging through Thomas's old papers, hunting for any sign of such a debt. In a small wooden chest, she found a stack of receipts, mostly for livestock sales, and a few letters from traders. Not one mentioned anything near $1,000. That night, with the wind howling outside, Delilah sat by the fire with Ephraim and said, "I think something's wrong. Thomas wasn't great with numbers, but he never borrowed that much money." Ephraim looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "Then we'll find out the truth," And he meant it. The next morning, Ephraim rode into town and sought out old lawyer Harland Boone. Boone studied Blackwood's documents, frowning. "This seal, something's off. And the signature I know Thomas Marsh's handwriting. This isn't it." When Ephraim told Delilah, she felt a spark of hope, but also a surge of unease. If this was forged, then Blackwood wasn't just after money. He meant to destroy everything they'd built. The mountain cabin was no longer entirely peaceful. Every sound of hooves in the yard made Delilah's heart leap. But one thing was constant. Ephraim never wavered. Whenever she faltered, he reminded her, "No matter what, you won't face this alone." And perhaps it was in this moment, standing on the edge of losing everything, that Delilah truly understood the weight of those wedding vows. What's yours is ours. You've probably heard the saying, "On the frontier alone you're weak, but together you're strong as steel." For Delilah and Ephraim, that saying wasn't advice. It was a lifeline in the days that followed, as the truth about the debt began to surface piece by piece. After that meeting with Harland Boone, Ephraim knew they needed more than just one man's opinion. They needed evidence and allies. He rode to every trusted friend in town, Samuel the blacksmith, Jake the saloon keeper, and Lucy from the general store, famous for knowing everything before it happens. One by one, they began digging into Thomas Marsh's old dealings. Lucy remembered that about 6 months before Thomas died, Blackwood had passed through town, asking a lot of questions about landowners in trouble. Samuel swore he'd seen Blackwood with a man named Carter, a slippery operator known for forging documents in land disputes. Meanwhile, Delilah wasn't just sitting on the mountain. She and Martha searched every drawer, trunk, and cupboard in her old house for more records. One morning, at the very bottom of a faded wooden chest, they found a copy of a contract for the sale of a lot of Thomas's horses, the proceeds more than enough to cover any real debt. The signature and legal seal on it were nothing like the ones on Blackwood's papers. Their greatest weapon was the community. As word spread that the debt papers might be fake, the townsfolk began openly siding with the Cutters. In the saloon, Jake accidentally let slip to Blackwood that Boone was preparing a lawsuit. At the market, Lucy just happened to say loud enough for everyone to hear that she'd overheard Carter bragging about making a fortune from a perfect fabrication. Piece by piece, the right words landed in the right ears, then found their way back to Delilah and Ephraim. On the 10th day, Samuel brought a piece of pure gold, not the kind you mine, but the kind that can turn the tide. It was a scrap of paper Carter had left behind in the blacksmith shop, covered with Thomas's signature, written over and over again. The handwriting wasn't a perfect match, but it was close enough to prove someone had been practicing a forgery. Boone immediately added it to the lawsuit file. When the arrest warrant was signed, it felt like the whole town was standing at Ephraim and Delilah's back. Sheriff Wade led them straight to the boarding house where Blackwood and Carter were staying. Blackwood kept his cool, but when Carter was found with a bag full of forged documents and illegal seals, the game was up. "You can't prove," Blackwood began, but Boone cut him off, dropping a thick stack of files onto the table, with the finality of a coffin lid slamming shut. In the makeshift courtroom set up in the town hall, folks packed in shoulder to shoulder, eager to see the swindlers dragged into the light. Delilah sat beside Ephraim, his hand wrapped firm around hers. When the judge declared the debt null and void and the Cutters' property safe, the roar of cheers shook the rafters. Men clapped Ephraim on the back. Martha hugged Delilah tight, and Lucy shot Blackwood a dozen victorious looks that could have knocked the wind out of him. On the ride back up the mountain, snow began to drift down in lazy flakes. Delilah leaned her head against Ephraim's shoulder and whispered, "I never thought people would stand up for us like that." "Out here," Ephraim said, "when you're part of the community, your trouble's everyone's trouble." That night they built the fire higher than usual. With the shadow of debt gone, the log cabin seemed twice as warm. Delilah placed the debt cancellation document in the old wooden chest, not to remember Blackwood, but to remember that they'd weathered a storm through faith and unity. If anyone asked what the most valuable thing they'd kept was, the answer wouldn't be land, the house, or the livestock. It was trust in each other, and in the people who would stand beside them when the world tried to knock them down. Some bonds are born from sweet words, but others are forged through trial, like steel tempered in fire and ice. For Delilah, the debt crisis hadn't just been a fight to save their home. It had been a test of her own heart. And when the dust settled, she realized that through all the wind-burned days and sleepless nights, Ephraim had become the one place she wanted to come home to. After that day in court, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted. It was no longer the careful warmth of two people just learning to live together, but a deeper peace, like they'd crossed the same battlefield and could finally breathe the same long breath. Delilah found herself smiling more when she saw him coming in from the stables. She began finding excuses to linger close, handing him his morning coffee, a little slower, brushing her hand against his shoulder when passing him a hammer on the roof. Ephraim was still Ephraim, quiet, solid, but something in his eyes had changed. The guarded distance of the early months was gone. Passing by her, his hand might rest lightly at her waist or on her back, a silent reminder, you're not alone. One evening after supper, Delilah stepped out onto the porch. Snow lay deep now, the moon painting the pine forest in silver. Ephraim came out carrying 2 mugs and poured hot spiced cider. They sat side by side, listening to the wind hum against the eaves. After a long while, Delilah said softly, I used to think, I married you because I needed a roof over my head. But the truth is, the roof's only warm because you're under it. Ephraim turned his gaze steady, as if reading her whole heart. I used to think I needed a wife so I could have children. But I've realized even if we never had a child, if I had you, I'd have enough. In that moment, every last bit of her guard fell away. She set her mug down and found his hand. He clasped hers, then leaned in and kissed her. Not rushed, but deep, the kind of kiss that says what words can't. That night they went to bed early. The firelight from the hearth bled through the curtain, bathing their skin in gold. Ephraim touched her with the patience of a man who had waited, and Delilah answered with the trust she'd once believed she'd never give to another. Every movement, every breath was a vow that they were together, not just for survival, but because they had truly found each other in this hard country. When their breathing slowed, Ephraim reached for a small wooden box on the table. Inside was a simple gold ring, finely etched with waves and mountains, the Cutter family's symbol for 3 generations. This was my mother's, he said, and my grandmother's before her. I want you to wear it not because you're my wife, but because you're the one I choose to love for the rest of my life. Delilah's throat tightened. She unclasped the chain that had always carried Thomas's wedding ring and placed it in Ephraim's hand. This is my past. I want you to keep it not to replace it, but to know that when I give you my heart, I'm giving you the whole story of what made me who I am. Ephraim took it without a word, just bent down and pressed a long kiss to her forehead. In the days that followed, their love didn't blaze like fireworks. It burned steady like a hearth fire in the middle of winter. Delilah found herself reaching for his hand in the marketplace, leaning into his shoulder on the wagon ride home. Ephraim smiled more often now, though he was still a man of few words, and had started calling her simple, tender names like darlin' or my girl when it was just the 2 of them. For them, love was no longer something to prove with promises of children or shared property. It was present in every breath, in the smallest acts, from Ephraim, hanging her favorite cup where she could reach it to Delilah, saving him the last bite of pie. And maybe in a land where winter lasted longer than summer, and life stood fragile against the wind and snow, this kind of love, quiet and stubborn, was the very thing that carried folks through. The long winter finally loosened its grip, giving way to the first gold threads of spring. Snow melted off the mountainside, revealing damp black soil and tiny green shoots pushing stubbornly toward the sun. In that fresh air, Delilah carried a secret fragile and brilliant, that she wasn't ready to speak aloud, yet wanting to feel it fully before sharing it. That morning, as she planted new lavender by the porch, she laid a hand on her belly and felt a strange warm rush through her. It wasn't the spring breeze, it was a tiny, steady heartbeat deep inside her. All that day she couldn't stop smiling the smile of someone who'd just found a pearl in the sand. That evening, when Ephraim came in from the pasture with dust still on his shirt, she called him over. "Ephraim." Delilah hesitated. We're going to have a baby." He froze, those blue eyes lighting like the sun had just broken over the horizon. Without a word, he scooped her up, spun her once, then kissed her forehead hard. "Darlin', you just gave me the greatest gift of my life." The news spread fast, not because they boasted, but because in a small town, joy always finds its way to everyone. Within days, Martha brought over a basket of red apples. Lucy sent a hand-knit wool blanket, and Samuel delivered a pine cradle he'd built himself. Each gift carried the warmth of care, and Delilah felt as though she was being held in the arms of the whole community. One afternoon, Jake the saloon keeper showed up with 3 others, each carrying fresh-cut boards. "Heard that back room's gonna be a nursery. A few extra hands ought to finish it faster." Ephraim only grinned, clapping each man on the shoulder, while Delilah brought out hot coffee for them all. A week later, the town hall was packed for a special celebration. Long tables groaned under pies, smoked meats, and steaming mugs of spiced cider. Lucy led a group of women in old lullabies while the children ran laughing between the chairs. When Martha stood to raise her glass, her voice caught. Coming together because you needed to survive is one thing, but staying together because of love and bringing a new life into it, that's rare. We're lucky to witness it. Sitting beside Ephraim, Delilah felt her throat tighten. She looked around at the faces, the same people who had stood by them against Blackwood, the ones who would stand up again if danger ever came. For the first time, she fully understood the word home, not just 4 walls, but the hearts willing to open to one another. When the party was over, they returned to the cabin. Moonlight spilled through the window onto the new cradle by their bed. Ephraim slipped an arm around her shoulders and murmured, "Our child's gonna grow up, knowing it belongs to a place where folks look out for each other." Delilah rested her head against his chest, hand smoothing over her belly. "And it'll know its parents found each other not by luck, but by choice." The days that followed were filled with happy preparations. Delilah stitched tiny shirts. Ephraim built a rack to hang them on. They chose a name together, talking about the values they wanted to raise their child with. Outside spring kept blooming, carrying the promise that when winter came again, they'd have not just each other, but a new life to love and protect. And if anyone asked them what happiness was, they'd only have to glance toward the small room at the back of the house where the pine cradle waited, and smile. Some promises are spoken just to ease a heart in the moment, but others become the pillars a whole life can rest on. For Delilah and Ephraim, the words, "Before winter you'll be carrying my son," had once been a plain, almost businesslike bargain on a cold Dakota morning. But as winter passed and spring arrived, they realized it wasn't just about a child. It was about a home of trust and a future they had built with their own hands, day by day, through trial and triumph. That spring, the whole valley came alive. The creek at the mountain's foot ran strong again. The migratory birds returned, and the pine trees breathed out their sharp, sweet resin into the warm air. In the log cabin, Delilah and Ephraim finished the last touches on the baby's room. Ephraim hung a painting of the mountain range his family had lived under for 3 generations, and Delilah placed on the shelf the children's books she had loved as a girl. One evening, they sat on the porch watching the sunset spill red across the slopes. Delilah leaned against her husband, her hand resting on the curve of her belly. "I still remember the day we met," she said, her voice a mix of wonder and gratitude. "Back then I thought I was just trying to find a way to get through the winter. But it turns out, I found an entire new life." Ephraim chuckled softly, his gaze fixed on the endless chain of mountains. "And I figure, A man can be born twice if he meets the right woman. They didn't need to say much more. Everything was already clear. Their love hadn't come from dances under lamplight or sweet words written on scented paper. It had been forged in the days of hauling timber to build a fence in the nights, weathering snowstorms together, in the steady tending of the kitchen fire, all through the long winter. The community around them understood that, too. Whenever Delilah went to market, folks would stop to ask after her health and slip her small gifts a jar of honey, a few apples, a knitted scarf. Ephraim, once a man who kept to himself, was now greeted everywhere he went, even invited to sit on the town council to help settle land disputes. One April evening, the town held its spring festival. Lanterns hung along the streets. The smell of roasting meat and apple pie filled the air. Delilah and Ephraim walked hand in hand past the vendor stalls, the lively sound of fiddle music following them. When Martha pulled them in for a photograph, the people gathered around didn't just smile politely. They smiled with pride, as if they all believed this couple's story was proof that love and trust still lived even on a harsh frontier. And later, as they made their way home under a moonlit sky, the dirt road winding up the mountain before them, Delilah realized that the promise of before winter had changed. It was no longer a rigid deadline. It had become a lifelong vow that through winter or spring, through fortune or hardship, they would keep that fire burning together. If you followed this story from the beginning, you know Ephraim and Delilah didn't just get lucky meeting each other. They chose each other, held on to each other, and fought for each other. They'd gone from strangers shaking hands to wedding vows through a debt crisis and on to the joy of expecting a new life. And in a country like America, where people are taught to stand on their own, but also to know when to lean on one another, their story is a reminder that true love isn't just a feeling. It's a choice you make over and over again every single day. Now, with spring rolling out over the Dakota grasslands, the question is, what comes next for them? I believe that with the strength and trust they've built, they'll raise that child in a loving community. Teach it to honor the land, and show it that family isn't just where you're born, it's where you're chosen to belong. If you've read this far, maybe you've grown a little fond of them too. So support them, even if it's only in your heart, by believing these values are still worth protecting. Share their story with someone who thinks they've missed their chance at happiness. Remind them that sometimes happiness doesn't arrive like a summer storm. It grows like a pine tree in the forest, slow, steady, but strong enough to stand for a lifetime. And if someday you happen to pass through a small Dakota town and see a tall man with blue eyes walking alongside a dark-haired boy or girl while a woman smiles from the porch of a log cabin, know that you've just seen a promise kept from before winter to forever after.